It was an ordinary night at the concert. A packed stadium, a roaring crowd, but then, Taylor Swift noticed someone in the audience. Someone she hadn't seen in decades. What happened next would leave everyone speechless. As her eyes scanned the crowd, she paused for just a fraction of a second, a moment so brief that only the most devoted fans might have noticed. In a sea of screaming faces, one stood out. A face she hadn't seen in decades, but could never forget. It was her teacher, the one who had believed in her, when even Taylor doubted herself. The face that had encouraged her to dream bigger, to take risks, and to believe in her music, when it was nothing more than scribbled lyrics in a notebook. A familiar face, one she hadn't seen in years, but instantly recognized. Her heart skipped a beat, but she continued the song, without faltering. Her voice steady, despite the surge of emotions. It wasn't until a natural break between songs, as she adjusted her earpiece backstage for a quick costume change, that she quietly turned to her team. "Can someone check if that's Mrs. Jacobs? In the third row of front section, she's wearing a white dress. If it is, let her know I'd like to meet her after the show," she said, her voice low but urgent. The team nodded and quickly set to work, leaving Taylor to prepare for the next set. Her heart raced at the thought of seeing her teacher again, after all these years. But she kept her emotions in check, as she returned to the stage. Backstage, the team scrambled to locate the woman Taylor had mentioned. Mrs. Jacobs, dressed elegantly yet modestly, sat quietly among the crowd, her eyes sparkling with pride. She hadn't expected Taylor to notice her. After all, she was just one person, in a massive arena. Mrs. Jacobs, now retired, had carefully saved up to attend the concert, knowing it might be her only chance to see Taylor perform live. She didn't expect to be noticed, she simply wanted to witness the incredible success of her former student, the shy girl she once encouraged to follow her dreams. As Taylor moved from one song to the next, she couldn't help but glance toward Mrs. Jacobs again, memories flooding back with every glance. She remembered sitting in Mrs. Jacobs' classroom, nervously strumming her guitar, for a school talent show audition. She remembered the quiet words of encouragement, "You have something special, Taylor. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." That had carried her through her toughest days. The concert roared on, but for Taylor, this night had taken on a new meaning. It wasn't just another performance, it was a chance to thank the person who had unknowingly shaped her path. By the time the final song ended and the lights dimmed, Taylor's team had already escorted Mrs. Jacobs backstage. The crowd began to disperse, unaware of the emotional reunion that was about to unfold. Mrs. Jacobs was led through the winding hallways by Taylor's team, her heart pounding with every step. She clutched her purse tightly, unsure of what to expect, but overwhelmed by the surreal nature of it all. The team stopped outside a modestly decorated room, the faint sound of Taylor's voice murmuring beyond the door. "She's right inside," one of the assistants said gently, holding the door open. Mrs. Jacobs stepped inside, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Taylor stood in the center of the room, still in her concert attire, but with a towel draped around her neck, her face glowing from the adrenaline of the performance. When she turned and saw Mrs. Jacobs, her eyes welled up instantly. "Mrs. Jacobs," she whispered, her voice breaking. She crossed the room in just a few steps, pulling her teacher into a warm embrace. "I can't believe it's you." Mrs. Jacobs, always poised, managed a soft laugh, despite the tears glistening in her eyes. "And I can't believe you still remember me," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. They sat down on a small couch, and for a few minutes, the world outside seemed to disappear. Taylor leaned forward, listening intently, as Mrs. Jacobs shared her journey since retirement. "I've been following your career, Taylor. Every step of the way, I've felt so proud. But I never imagined I'd ever see you perform live, let alone get a chance to speak to you again." Taylor smiled, her expression a mix of nostalgia and gratitude. "You were the first person who ever told me I could do this," she said softly. "When I was struggling to find my place, your words gave me the confidence to keep going. I don't think I ever thanked you properly." Mrs. Jacobs waved her hand dismissively. "You were always going to be something special, Taylor. I just pointed out what was already there. The rest, you did on your own." But Taylor shook her head, her voice firm. "No, you did more than that. You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. That's something I'll never forget. This moment wasn't just about reconnecting, it was about showing Mrs. Jacobs how deeply her words had mattered. Taylor leaned back, her eyes sparkling with determination. You know, she said softly, I think it's time I pay it forward. Mrs. Jacobs looked at her, her curiosity piqued. Pay it forward, Taylor, you don't owe me anything. All I ever wanted was for my students to believe in themselves. Taylor smiled, a mix of gratitude and resolve in her expression. And that's exactly what you gave me. The conversation continued late into the night, with both women reminiscing about the past and marveling at how far life had brought them. By the end of their reunion, Taylor had made up her mind. This wasn't going to be just a fleeting moment. She was going to honor Mrs. Jacobs in a way that would leave a legacy. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight streamed through her hotel room window, Taylor sat with her laptop open, a determined expression on her face. The reunion with Mrs. Jacobs had stirred something deep within her. She knew she couldn't let this moment end with a simple thank you. It needed to be more, something lasting, something meaningful. Taylor reached out to her team, gathering them for an early meeting. I want to set up a scholarship, she announced, her tone firm yet brimming with emotion. Something in Mrs. Jacobs' name. It'll support students who want to pursue the arts, but might not have the means to do so. Her manager looked at her, a bit surprised by the sudden decision, but immediately supportive. Do you have a specific school or program in mind? He asked. Taylor didn't hesitate. It has to be the school where I studied, where Mrs. Jacobs taught. That's where it all started for me. Taylor personally chose the name, a tribute to the woman who had encouraged her to embrace her creativity. As her team worked behind the scenes, Taylor wanted to do something personal for Mrs. Jacobs right away. She sat at a small desk in her room, carefully writing a letter in her neat, deliberate handwriting. Dear Mrs. Jacobs, I've said it before, but I can't say it enough. Thank you. Meeting you again reminded me of how much your words shaped my life. You'll never know just how much they meant to me. I wanted to do something to honor you and the incredible impact you've had on so many lives. I've started a scholarship in your name at our school, dedicated to helping students who dream of a future in the arts. I hope it will inspire others the way you inspired me. With all my love and gratitude, Taylor. Taylor carefully folded the letter, placing it inside an elegant envelope. To make the gesture even more special, she included a framed photo of the two of them from the night before, and a bouquet of vibrant sunflowers, Mrs. Jacobs' favorite, as she had mentioned in passing years ago. Taylor hoped these small gifts would express the depth of her gratitude. The next afternoon, a delivery arrived at Mrs. Jacobs' modest home. She opened the door to find a courier holding a beautifully wrapped package. Inside, she found the letter, the flowers, and the photo. As she read Taylor's words, tears streamed down her face. She placed the letter gently on the table, her hands trembling as she looked at the photo. But it wasn't until a few days later, when a former colleague called her, that she learned about the scholarship. Did you see the news? Her friend asked excitedly. Taylor Swift started a scholarship in your name. It's all over the school website. They're calling it the Jacobs Arts Scholarship. Mrs. Jacobs gasped, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and disbelief. Taylor didn't have to do this, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Well, she wanted to. Her friend replied, You've always been the kind of teacher who left a mark. Mrs. Jacobs sat quietly for a long time. Staring at the framed photo of her and Taylor, she whispered, I never imagined the shy girl with a guitar would touch my life in a way I'll never forget. Stories like these take time and effort to create. If this story touched your heart, please consider supporting us. Even a small contribution helps us continue sharing meaningful stories like this. You can find the link in the description below. buymeacoffee.com/trendytalks. Thank you for being part of our journey.